Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 5th of December 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we will be joined in just a few moments by Mark Anderson from American Free Press, who is awake on a very chilly morning in Phoenix, Arizona. Well, the weather here in UK, we've got mixed reports. Plymouth is pretty cold, dull, chilly. Manchester is quite mild, apparently. Mild in Glasgow and beautiful in Norfolk. So people have woken up there very happy, but I'm sure the Conservative government will squash that pretty quickly.
Yes. Now, Mark Anderson over the weekend has been at a conference, Global Warming, an Inconvenient Lie. So before we say hello to Mark, we're just going to play out a short piece of video here that was recorded just before that. And apologies for the mic's a little bit hot on this, but you'll get the point.
Hello, I'm Mark Anderson of American Free Press. It's December 2nd, 2016, and I'm coming to you from Phoenix, Arizona, at the resort, the Marriott Tempe at the Buttes, as it's known. But what's especially interesting is that starting today, there's a 3-day conference by Freedom Force International, their third Congress, in fact, and the topic is Global Warming, an Inconvenient Lie. What do they mean? Well, the attendees, led by noted author G. Edward Griffin, who penned the book The Creature from Jekyll Island about the privately run and owned Federal Reserve central bank system, led by him, they're going to explore the common global warming narrative and counter that narrative. That narrative claims that the routine agricultural, industrial, and other activities of mankind, the emissions from these things, cause global warming, otherwise known as climate change. And with this conference, that narrative will be challenged from the educational, media, scientific, environmental, and other angles. They'll even get into more controversial topics like geoengineering and the modification of the weather. And so, on behalf of American Free Press, this begins in cooperation with Livestream.com and my videographer, Ron Avery. This begins ongoing coverage of this important and notable conference to give more perspective and balance to an issue that typically is told from one side. People that don't necessarily accept the common narrative are, for instance, called climate deniers. We take no position on that, but we seek to explore the entire issue, the entire spectrum of this issue, to see where the facts really lie and where the facts really come down. So stay tuned here on live stream and through American Free Press, including AmericanFreePress.net, for updates on this all-important issue that we'll continue to explore and get the facts out. Thank you for listening. I'm Mark Anderson with American Free Press.
So Mark, who all was there? I believe Lord Monckton was there.
Christopher Monckton was there, and some 15 speakers, without counting exactly on the list. There was also, of course, G. Edward Griffin himself, the one I mentioned there. And there was Alex Newman, a noted journalist. Part of his writing is for the New American Magazine. There was also Tim Ball, Professor Tim Ball from the University of Winnipeg. And William Happer, Professor William Happer of Princeton, Holly Swanson, who came at it from the educational angle, she's an author, Patrick Wood, the noted author who he was among the first to expose the Trilateral Commission when they first came out, and there was an activist from California, some different people. The one on geoengineering and weather modification was Jim Lee, a private investigator, and on down the list. And it was quite interesting. Some speakers were brought in by like a video Skype feed later on in a theater, the ones that couldn't make it here in person. So overall, it was quite informative, and it really came at the media a lot too, in terms of the media bias. There was a lot of emphasis on how the media has just botched this issue altogether. And naturally, I focused quite a bit on that, but I tried to be as comprehensive as possible. We posted about a dozen videos or so over the course of the 3 days.
So what was the main theme? Was it, I mean, for example, was Monckton coming at this from an economic point of view, and was he talking about energy, for example, I mean, I know that perhaps he's pro hydraulic fracturing and shale gas and oil extraction, but what was his main topic?
His main topic, actually, and I double checked this with him after he was done, excuse me, was more of a mathematical equation type thing. He didn't get into his views on fracking and those sorts of things. What he did was he showed some mathematical angles and explained how they've botched and completely screwed up the math that is used in collaboration with the climate model. So I want to explain this right. In collaboration with the computer climate models, he's explaining that the math they use has been completely screwed up, and therefore it shows a curve in predicted temperatures that is far warmer than it would otherwise be if you do the math correctly. So let's say over 100 years, with their bad math, they'll claim that the mean temperature will go up some 10 or 12 degrees. He said if you correct the math, the temperature over 100 years will only go up 2 or 3 degrees. So he expounded on that the math is bad, the science is bad, and that their predictions are call for far higher temperatures. Excuse me, it's pretty early here than you would otherwise get if you had the math right. And so he was one of the more technical ones. He's a trained mathematician and a schooled architect as well.
Okay, and so total range of subjects then?
A very wide range, as I mentioned in the opening video. Well, his was the mathematical or technical angle, the educational angle, the particularly interesting media angle, and all these other ways, the ways kids are indoctrinated in the global warming narrative. It's a lot of material to cover in our current format here for today's show, but there was a video the night before this thing that kind of set the tone before they got into the meat of the program, and it showed how they skew the statistics. Like 97% of all scientists agree that global warming is a real thing based on our industrial and agricultural emissions. But they're basing that on only a small slice of all the peer-reviewed studies that are out there. There's something like, in round numbers, 12,000 peer-reviewed studies, and they're trying to imply that 97% of those are backing the current global warming narrative, the politically correct one, you might say. But in fact, it's less than 100 of those studies, and then they say it's 97% of that amount. So they slice off a tiny fraction of the studies, and then they say 97% of that. So this was verified a couple different times for me. So the common media narrative that 97% support this is evidently very, very skewed and not to be believed.
So are you suggesting could it be the case that with this, as with other subjects, we could use the term fake news, perhaps?
Well, certainly that came about very quickly at this. Alex Newman spoke. He writes sometimes for the New American Magazine and other outlets. He gave a very intelligent outlook on fake news. And in fact, what's going on is, to the extent that he described how the news media parrots the official line on global warming without dissent being allowed. It's got to be our own fault if we burn firewood, if we run our cars too much. The everyday people are blamed when in fact far more enormous amounts of so-called greenhouse gases are used by the huge ships that go back and forth from the US to China to deliver all the free trade goods in such massive amounts. And that pollution actually has a discernible effect on the weather in some respects. And maybe we can't get into all the details, but the wrong people are being blamed to the extent that the weather is affected at all in any way. But long-term global warming just doesn't hold any water, and yet the media parrots only one side of this issue without dissent allowed. So yes, Alex Newman therefore concluded the real fake news is the so-called mainstream media, and they're not the mainstream media because they're so out of touch with the mainstream that they're actually the fringe media. So ABC, NBC, the BBC, they're the fake news, they're the fringe.
Absolutely.
That's the consensus.
millions of people analysing what they're putting out. I think they're on the loser.
Yeah, they're reacting the way they are right now. And I'll mention that Patrick and I had a very good discussion. There is a Daniel Sidursky, and he's created a voluntary download browser that you can get through Safari and Mozilla and Chrome, and that browser will download the media hit list. And calling the alternative media, the so-called alternative media like you guys and me and others, calling us fake news. And watched, and it's concerning. It's a little unsettling, but I believe, ultimately, if we stick to our guns and keep things straight ahead and factual and stay on it, ultimately the so-called mainstream media, the real fake media, will, with a little prayer, fall by the wayside.
Absolutely. Well, look, let's just mention Trump because he has started his thank you tour and started it a few days ago in Cincinnati. And Reuters here pretty upset about it. So you might say that they realize they've overdone it, but still, Reuters sort of made a big deal of the fact that, or at least what they said was that the venue for this rally was only 2/3 full. Well, in fact, that really wasn't the case. Because in the first few minutes of his speech, he said, "Well, I don't know what I didn't know what came with this position when I took it, and I didn't appreciate that they closed the roads for an hour and a half before the." So basically, as he was, this was through the action of the his protection crew, and basically as he was speaking, there were people still coming in. The place was rammed. It wasn't only 2/3 full; it was absolutely packed. And so what was he talking about? He was mainly saying thank you to everybody for electing him, but he was talking about how he was going to redevelop the country. He was talking about how he was going to invest in infrastructure, and we'll be coming on to British infrastructure investment in a minute, and we'll sort of perhaps see a slight difference in the approach here. But what he absolutely made clear was that he is going to cooperate with any country interested in destroying Islamic State. He is not. He has absolutely come out against this whole regime change agenda. Now, there were a few things in his speech that I wasn't 100% comfortable with, and I'm going to do a little bit more work on that. Some of the language that he used and so on. He certainly was very keen, as part of his infrastructure development, to discuss promoting shale gas and shale oil production. So some people aren't going to be too happy with that. But nonetheless, it was, as an overall sort of thank you speech, it was sort of a pretty positive. He was giving a very positive message. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure you haven't seen this yet, Mark, but you know, the media still continues to get their little jibes in wherever they can.
Yes, I was talking about Brexit with one of the participants here at the Global Warming Conference that just wound up, and I think his name was Edward Radcliffe. I'm double checking that right now, and he was saying that.
And I think Mark's just gone. Are you still there, Mark?
No, doesn't look like it. Oh, he's come back.
You're back.
Did you lose my signal?
Yeah, I lost you for a couple. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, Edward Goodliff was speaking on Brexit. He was talking about it over some beverages last night, and he was saying how he didn't believe in Brexit being real, that Theresa May, in his opinion, he's from Devon, you're part of England originally, and he didn't believe Theresa May was for real about Brexit and that she'd never actually allow it to fully implement. And what he meant by that was, it's the whole thing is kind of farcical, although it reflects the will of the British people, however, to get out of EU. Well, the Trump campaign, in a like manner, reflected the will of the American people to adopt a somewhat more nationalistic populism kind of system, and that's a parallel with Brexit. And yet the media still continues to pound on Trump almost as if he hasn't been elected yet. And I think it's because of what Trump represents, not just Trump himself being elected, but because he's kind of the spokesman or the would-be spokesman for that part of the American electorate that has woken up a little more and is trying to get out of its sleep and slumber and break out of this internationalist prison that the elites have locked us in. So I think that's a major reason the media does that. It's what Trump represents with regards to the people, and it's similar to the Brexit thing in that sense.
Okay, well, let's just ask that question, because has Trump finally been elected? Because we see that, another meeting of the Electoral College coming in the not too distant future, and Hillary Clinton here asking for help with the Michigan recount. In fact, there are recounts happening in a few different places. Is that correct?
Yes, the close states where Trump and Hillary were the closest, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. The Michigan Secretary of State, I'll be talking to them very shortly. In Michigan, and I used to be an election worker in Michigan for 1 year. I was trained there. Excuse me. In Michigan, all vote counts are unofficial until the Board of Canvassers meets 3 or 4 weeks after the general election and certifies the election. The Board of Canvassers in Michigan did meet in the end of November and certified that Trump won by some 10,700 votes without looking at it. I believe it's 10-7. So the Michigan part of this is considered official now. And exactly how this is going to play out, I'm not sure, but there's a pretty good consensus. My news friend, Gary Franchi at the Next News Network in Illinois, he believes the same, that Jill Stein of the Green Party has been a go-between, a proxy for Hillary Clinton to take some of the heat off Hillary, to make it look like Jill Stein wanted the recount. And yet it came out that Hillary actually wants this behind the scenes, while verbally or publicly indicating she doesn't want the recount. So it's pretty certain that Jill Stein I don't want to make any predictions right now, but of course I can be on your show again before then. I believe I should, because I think we need to nail this down a little harder.
Yeah.
But at this point, I think it's desperation on the part of the Clintons, or at least diversionary. it would cause quite the ruckus if something were second guessed on this. That's for sure. So it bears watching.
Okay, well, look, let's make a little bit of progress through some of this stuff then. Of course, Italy held their referendum over the weekend, and Renzi lost, so he is now gone as Prime Minister. Well, this is just another example of the sort of mindset of people as this progresses around the world. Today, in the Supreme Court, we've got the judges deciding on Brexit. Well, of course, they're not really deciding on Brexit at all, because Brexit decision was made in the referendum. It's now being systematically ignored by various people. Of course, the judges will make a decision on a point of law, which will just throw the thing up into the air without any doubt. What can we say? The judges are going to get the blame for this, and it's going to get people at each other's throats. That's the intention. We're not going to progress towards Brexit because the intention isn't that we do so.
We just add to that, of course, we can see that appointments of judges is through the Judicial Appointments Committee, but who appoints the committee, we still don't have an answer on that. And if anybody out there can assist on that point, we would like to know. So it's not who appoints the judges, that's the committee. Who is it that appoints the committee? Ultimately, it'd be interesting to know who is appointing these judges. I think we'll find it goes around in a very nice circle.
Yes.
Well, on the subject of Brexit, a man who might be expected to say we can't really leave because we need Europol is none other than Rob Wainwright, who's the director of Europol. And he says that Brexit would harm UK's crime fighting, and we risk losing access to a European security database used daily by the police. So we must have Europol, we must have the EU because we can use a database. Well, this man's obviously an intellect. How do we know that? Because he was a former MI5 analyst. And these are some of the things he said, that EU police cooperation has become an important third pillar for British security over the past decade, alongside intelligence links with European and US security services. Interesting language, I thought, the pillar. Take any one of those pillars away, and of course it has the potential to negatively impact the fight against terrorism and serious crime. So in this little speech, he was getting very much that we've got to be frightened of terrorism, and we'll come on to that. But here's the database, the Schengen Information System, SIS. Is that same as ISIS? It's pretty close, isn't it? It is confusing to know who the rebels are and the good terrorists and the bad terrorists, but this is a vast database of 64 million pieces of information. I'd have thought that was a pretty small database myself, but it's a vast database of 64 million pieces of information used by 29 European countries, and these are alerts related to passport identity records. It says it's also got information on 35,000 criminal suspects, 88,000 missing people, and nearly 500,000 non-EU citizens denied entry to Europe. Well, I'll just bring in the little arrow there because I wonder if those 300 missing Syrian children are part of the work of Europol. I think we might see if that's the case. So let's carry on with what Mr. Wainwright has to say. He said he's often misquoted as saying there are 5,000 terrorists running around Europe. There are not. There are 5,000 that have gone out. We think around a third of them have come back, and of those, the majority do not pose any terrorist threat.
So they're not terrorists then?
Well, he says we've got to be afraid because there are very few terrorists, and they're not even sure of the ones who they think could be terrorists, whether they are terrorists, and if they're good terrorists or bad terrorists.
Well, this is clearly a good service that Europol is providing Europe's police forces.
Well, stay with it because it gets better. Anyway, he says that what we've just read, that still gives rise to a very substantial number of terrorists. So it's a very small number. And we're facing a very serious threat.
But it's substantially small?
It's substantially small.
Right, okay.
I hope you're following this, Mark, because, of course, this is how Mr. Wainwright, who's part of MI5, evaluates terrorism. It's very confusing. Now, we thought we'd have a look at Europol because he's the boss. Let's see the quality of product that Europol produces. So here we are. Let's go to the website. And they've got a little Christmas edition of EU's Most Wanted People.
An advent calendar.
Yeah, EU Most Wanted December campaign with a little Father Christmas hat and a Christmassy theme. And if you think I'm joking, we just have a little look at the video that's underneath this. It's a little bit crude because I took it quickly, but this is the quality of Mr. Wainwright's Europol. It's really spectacular. It's got very spooky music, Christmassy theme, and of course nothing to do with terrorism. This is a criminal, Cyprus, killed 3 people in a restaurant, nasty man, and the whole video is about criminals.
I have to say that actually I strongly recommend everybody goes to the Europol website and looks at this little video.
Well, you've got to have it with the music, Mike,
yes,
because this is utterly vile stuff. I would say that it's designed to damage your mind because you're not really sure what you're looking at there.
Well, because it's got all this Christmassy feel and then it's got some pretty dark music to go with it.
But what they're not talking about is terrorists. What they're talking about are criminals, international criminals. So I think Mr. Wainwright's confused, but if he's paid by Europol, probably he is going to say that we need to stay in Europol.
Yes. Okay, Aleppo then. Aleppo almost done and dusted as a campaign. Syrian rebels set to lose another Aleppo district, according to Reuters here. That's according to an insurgent. I'm not sure whether he's a rebel, an insurgent, or a terrorist. But anyway, Reuters saying another key district of eastern Aleppo has effectively fallen to advancing Syrian government forces, a rebel official said on Monday, as the army and allied militia pressed its assault against the opposition-held enclave. And actually, Sputnik today reporting that eastern Aleppo militants are in talks with the Syrian army, secret talks, they say, to discuss the terms of a surrender. So perhaps the Aleppo situation is going to resolve itself very, very quickly. And no doubt focus will move on to Idlib, which seems to be where most of these people are heading off to once they get out. Now, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody that has contributed to Vanessa's trip to Syria. Vanessa just wanted me to pass on her thanks and to say, if you are making a contribution via the wallwillfall.org, please don't mark the donation with the word Syria in any way. You might say UKC or something just to let her know where the money's come from, but not Syria, because PayPal is blocking any donations that they feel may be related to Syria in any way.
And according to Mr. Wainwright, so as things get better in Syria, the terrorist threat is going up.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. And of course, at the heart of the terrorist threat is NATO. And you can make of that statement as you wish. And Jens Stoltenberg today making an introductory speech, an introduction to what's happening over the next couple of days, which is the NATO foreign ministers meeting. And he said over the next 2 days, NATO foreign ministers will meet and address the most pressing security challenges we're facing and how we are responding. He said at first they will discuss NATO-EU cooperation, because stronger cooperation between NATO and the EU is one key way to strengthen our response to a more challenging security environment at a time when the peaceful order is being challenged in new ways. NATO and the EU need to work closer than ever before. And he said, at all levels, from staff-to-staff talks to my regular meetings with Presidents Tusk and Juncker, because the EU needs 2 presidents, of course, and High Representative Federica Mogherini, and our participation at each other's ministerials and summits, we've moved step by step in a pragmatic way, which benefits all our nations. And this week, I expect we'll take a significant step forward by endorsing a package of more than 40 measures to implement the joint declaration, which I signed together with President Tusk and President Juncker in July in Warsaw. And so he goes on. Now, one of the things he said is that tomorrow they are going to discuss the progress they've made, boosting the capacity of our neighbours to the east and the south, including their support for the counter-ISIL coalition, training of Iraqi officers, and the new Operation Sea Guardian in the Mediterranean. So I just thought it would be amusing, Brian, perhaps, to have a look at, let's look at the Russian sort of position in the Mediterranean at the moment. They've got the Kuznetsov there, for example. So I just thought we'd have a look at Operation Sea Guardian in comparison with this. So Russia has got their aircraft carrier there in the Mediterranean, and NATO has that.
Yeah.
So there you go. That is the image that NATO wants to present Operation Sea Guardian as. Now, what is it? It's what they say about Sea Guardian is that maritime security is high on NATO's agenda. As part of the 2011 Alliance Maritime Strategy, NATO has created a flexible maritime operation called Sea Guardian. This operation was created at the Warsaw Summit in July 2016. It can perform a broad range of marine security tasks and is currently operating in the Mediterranean. It has launched a flexible maritime operation, 7 maritime security operational tasks: maritime situational awareness, freedom of navigation, maritime interdiction, countering and proliferating of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Does that look like the type of equipment that is going to do that?
Well, I mean, this is small-scale boarding operations and what's going on here, Mike. I do notice the rigid inflatable boat, and of course Michael Fallon was boasting a few weeks ago at Portsmouth that there was a 60 million contract for a lot more of these rubber boats for the Royal Navy. So
we can see where that's
just
going.
Going to stop there, I think.
Yes, very wise. And just to finish with Jens Stoltenberg, then he said that on Wednesday they will also hold a meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Commission. We've got to keep the pressure on Russia, of course. So he went on to say the security situation in the eastern Ukraine remains extremely serious. So what did Boris have to say? Well, he said the Russian interference also continues. Despite the horrific scenes in Aleppo, the fight against Daesh is making progress. Despite the horrific, so the Syrian army is going and dealing with ISIS, but in spite of that, the fight against Daesh is making progress.
The dialogue is becoming more and more bizarre, Mike, because of course these people don't know what to say. They start off by lying. They're now getting caught up by their own lies, so they just produce words which of course make them look more and more ridiculous.
Absolutely.
This is positive when you see them come out with this nonsense.
And something that both Boris and Jens Stoltenberg were really driving home was Boris's quote here is, in Afghanistan, another tough fighting season is drawing to a close, is what he's saying there. And Stoltenberg absolutely reinforcing the desire for NATO to remain in Afghanistan, because otherwise they can't protect the poppy crops.
And get the taxes out, as we've seen.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, tonight, Monday live programs tonight. Ian Crane will be back. There'll be no Humanity versus Insanity this week, because this week is the 100th episode of Fracking Nightmare. So Ian wants to concentrate on that. So at 7:30 we will repeat last week's Humanity versus Insanity, and join us at 9 p.m. tonight for the 100th episode of Fracking Nightmare.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Somebody in our chat box came out with a little statement saying end poverty through death. And that was a pretty appropriate statement. Let's have a look at what's starting to happen around elderly people in UK. So the Mail here with a headline, anger as local councils are given the power to seize pensioners' homes to pay for rising care costs. And basically we've got an acceleration of literally the theft of private property. So go near the care system when you're a mature person, and we can see more and more that the state is going to have your property if you take anything out of the care system. So this is part of this article. Homes of the elderly and vulnerable are being taken by local authorities to pay for residential care bills. Now, there was a proposal that people shouldn't pay more than £72,000, so they wouldn't lose all their assets. But local authorities are now saying, no, we must be able to take the whole house because otherwise we can't pay for the care. And the so-called deferred payment agreements see elderly people hand over their properties to councils, which then hold the homes as collateral and cover costs on their behalf. And of course, this is ripe for fraud and corruption. Some 55 councils have taken part with nearly 3,000 DFAs. And it's pointing out there we're now up to 400,000 people who are at risk of having their property simply stolen by the state.
I mean, I have to say, Brian, that aside from the risk of corruption, which is huge, just the fact that people who have been paying into the system all their lives are having their assets taken in this way, it just beggars belief.
It's outrageous, but it's also very dangerous, as we're going to now show. So we'll follow this through. These are the sorts of headlines that we've been seeing. This was from the Telegraph about a year ago, I think. Inheritance tax windfall for the Treasury after winter death rate soar. So death equals profit, which is what our viewer was talking about. The government's going to pull in a quick 200 million this year, so 2016, as more people have to pay inheritance tax. And I had tweeted out a few months ago that Tory were going to cash in, surprisingly, after the flu vaccine has been pushed at elderly people, and all of a sudden we're seeing an increase in the winter death rates amongst elderly people. But I also pointed out that it was just a coincidence this was happening as David Cameron was talking about a, quote, dementia goal of 2 million people by 2050. And this is part of that. Prime Minister's challenge on dementia 2020. Well, it wasn't a challenge. This was basically rewarding doctors with cash bonuses. And they were going to get those bonuses for diagnosing people with dementia and prescribing disease modifying, that's their words, not mine, disease modifying drugs. So let's bring in the BBC and fake news, and here it is, and it's pretty direct. Dementia is now leading the cause of death. Well, this has got to be fake news because dementia is not a terminal illness. But if you read the BBC's article, of course, this is what they try and tell you. Last year, more than 61,000 people died of dementia, 11.6% of all recorded deaths. This has got to be fake news because dementia itself doesn't kill you. But they bring in the statistics to try and make it all look good. So here again on this graph, which is showing the difference between dementia and heart disease, dementia killing women, heart disease killing women, and the dementia in blue has passed the heart disease, according to the BBC. Here's the headline: dementia is the leading cause of death for women. That statement is untrue. And they produce a similar graph for men. And at the moment, the heart attack is still winning in the death state. So the Express is on the same line. So dementia death toll rises twofold amongst over 65. So we've got the dementia clearly here as the cause of death. And then they say that in more than half of the cases, the illness was recorded as an underlying cause of death or as a contributory cause, which is the truthful statement because, of course, dementia itself does not kill. But let's bring in the Alzheimer's Society, of course, who say they're there to help stop problems with dementia. And we picked this out, which we thought was very important. Some of the drugs that are frequently prescribed for behavioural symptoms in people with dementia can have severe side effects and may increase the person's confusion. So the doctors are getting bonuses for prescribing the drugs, and Alzheimer's is calmly saying, well, we know that some of these drugs actually make people appear to have dementia. So if you're a suspicious person, there's room for some very unpleasant things going on here. But here is the Alzheimer's talking about the causes of death, and we get into the meat of it here. Although dementia is a life-shortening illness, another condition or illness, such as pneumonia, may actually cause a person's death. And they end by saying that pneumonia is listed as the ultimate cause of death in up to 2/3 of people with dementia. So let's put this picture together. And here is the Prime Minister. He's somehow able to forecast that 2 million people will have dementia by 2050. How is he able to do that, Mike?
Because they're diagnosing people with dementia that don't have it.
I think this is where it's heading. We'll remind ourselves that the government now wants us to believe that if you get dementia, it's going to kill you. And of course, who better to push that out than the BBC? We can bring in this one here because we see half of care homes regarded as being substandard. And we're now clearly being told by Alzheimer's that within those care homes, drugs are being used which induce symptoms of dementia. Government's told you dementia kills. So now we can expect these elderly people to die. And on their way to death, in step the local authorities with the NHS, social service, and the Court of Protection to take their property. So the listener or the viewer to the programme today who said end poverty through death, well, the Conservative government has got the machinery set up for it.
Yeah. Mark, you had some thoughts?
Absolutely. Michigan, through the Medicaid system, has the exact kind of mechanics lined up to repossess the property of people that they believe have drawn too much from the public health and welfare system for the elderly support system. So the exact same thing is happening in several states here. Michigan is one of them. So again, we see these parallels between the UK and the US. And it's important to note, if we didn't have a debt-based money system, if we went to something like the Bradbury Pound and advanced and built upon that, let's say, and money wasn't born as debt, then our governments wouldn't be so far in.
RBS settling shareholders' lawsuits as part of an £800 million deal. So more money going out of RBS, which doesn't have any money to put out anyway, because of their bad behaviour in the past. This is investors who were misled just in the run-up to 2008. They were encouraged to buy RBS stock in a £12 billion fundraising drive. And of course, that £12 billion disappeared pretty quickly immediately after the 2008 crash, and then the taxpayer ended up putting another 45 billion in. So they're giving back 800 million pounds of that 12 billion pound. So that seems like a good deal. In the meantime, Liam Fox, well, what was he up to? He was speaking at the World Trade Organization in Geneva. Well, it was this little, there was nothing really in the speech that we hadn't heard before, but it was this little quote talking about the World Trade Organization and saying the deals signed at the WTO have lifted millions from poverty and created a world that few of those who signed GATT in 1947 would have thought possible. Well, I think that we don't have time for the discussion on this now, but there's a bit of debate could be had on if millions were lifted from poverty, how many were kept in poverty as a result of it, but that's for another time. Today, the UK government has released its latest national infrastructure pipeline, and we're just going to mention this because it's amusing by comparison with what Trump is proposing. So let's have a look at some of the things that are on it. 500 billion pounds is what they're proposing: communications, education, energy, flood defences, health, home office, housing, and I'm not quite sure what Home Office infrastructure is, but anyway, Ministry of Defence infrastructure, police forces infrastructure, science and research, transport. These are the types of things they're talking about. All these tranches of money that they claim, as I say, £500 billion. But when you actually read the front page of the thing, it says the overall pipeline is not a statement of need or a commitment to undertake all or any specific projects or programs shown. And basically, it's just pie in the sky nonsense, Brian. There is no money there for it. They're not putting any money into it. There is no actual infrastructure building going on, really. It's just a headline figure that they can talk about. So they have to have the disclaimer. I just thought it was classic. And we're going to end with this fantastic
news.
This fantastic news. Now, politics.co.uk absolutely determined at the end of this little article to say that the opinions expressed in the article are not necessarily those of politics.co.uk, but nonetheless, they carried the article. And what's it saying? It says Blair's legacy, Tony Blair's legacy is mixed, but we need him now. Goodbye, Tony Blair Associates. Hello, the Tony Blair Institute. Finally, the grand old man of progressive politics has enjoyed a Damascene conversion and understood that maybe, just maybe, he had a role in triggering Brexit and the ugly backlash against globalisation. And they say that Blair's new institute can only be welcomed after the death of Margaret Thatcher. Blair is now the biggest beast former politician the UK has.
Great man.
Yeah, great man. And they say this is the tragedy of Blair, that he was perhaps the only politician who could have saved Britain's place in the European Union, as Gordon Brown was the only politician who managed to save the union with Scotland. Okay, just try not to be sick just yet, Brian. As yet, the decade after he left office made this impossible. He traded a final political triumph for short-term relevance. Perhaps we will see the rebirth of Tony Blair through his institute. I personally hope so, but his legacy is a mixed one. I don't think his legacy is a mixed one at all. His legacy is purely a disaster for this country and for the world.
Indeed. And I wonder, I might be indulged, because I thought there was a missing slide which is turned up here, and I think it's appropriate to end on, because we'll jump from Tony Blair, the man to keep us in the EU. Let's come and have a look at Europol, because I'd meant to have this document on screen, changes in modus operandi of Islamic State revisited. So this is the document you need to read from Europol. And what do they say? Well, down here they say that basically if ISIS is defeated or severely weakened in Syria, Iraq by the coalition forces, there may be an increased rate in the return of foreign fighters and their families from the region, and this will increase the terrorist threat. So we don't really want to stamp out terrorism in Iraq, and certainly not in Syria, because according to Europol, the terrorist threat will go up. It's confusing, Mike.
I think if Tony Blair is brought back into British politics, that puts the terrorist threat through the roof. That one man.
Indeed, but hemp rope will be cheap, and we're now totally convinced of the benefits of hemp rope for anybody who's interested in that sort of thing.
Yes. So that's about it.
I'll end on that. Mark, thank you very much for joining us. There we have it. Dire news from UK, but it's becoming ever more obvious that we have a dictatorship rapidly installing itself. And what do they need? Of course, fake news and propaganda. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.